Okay, I'm going to get started here. Assume people will continue to flow in. It's my great honor and privilege to invite or to have Peter Groeneveld here today. He's a long-term friend and colleague and remarkable individual, as I hope you'll hear from his talk today. He has done training at some pretty lousy places: Harvard, Tufts, UCSF, Stanford. Now is at Penn. He's sort of the bad boy. But despite that, he actually is remarkably deserving of actually all the credit and acclaim that he's had. I'm not going to go through all his awards and others, but he's published in all the best journals. He has 2 R01s right now, which many of our colleagues need to sort of think about, and a number of other wonderful things. You're going to hear today about a topic that's very important to us here and very near to our hearts: comparative effectiveness with cardiovascular devices. Thanks,
Great.
Peter.
Thanks very much, Eric, and I also want to thank Adrian and others who organized my visit down here. It's been a real privilege to be at DCRI. I've heard and I've read so much of your research and know so many of you from meetings. It's just really great to be here. So I'm going to be talking about CER and CER being the mantra of comparative effectiveness research, which is the watchword for the kind of stuff we do nowadays. It's been newly named. It's always good to have your research renamed by the federal government. But there's also the CER of critical economic realities that I think in the wake of the Accountable Care Act that we continue to be able to avoid as a society. But there are some realities that we will need to face. So let's see. There we go. So some disclaimers. I'm probably going to share some opinions today, and they are my very own, and they certainly do not reflect the opinions of the Department of Veterans Affairs or any of my funders, NIH, AHRQ, or the Pennsylvania Department of Health. I have received some research support from the Institute for Medical Technology Studies, which is a cleverly named foundation that receives its own support from medical device companies. I have received honoraria for speaking at medical technology conferences. I do not receive support from medical device companies. This is, I'll get it. There we go. My wonderful team of colleagues and research staff includes these individuals, especially Dan Polsky and Andy Epstein, who've taught me an enormous amount of healthcare economics that I somehow avoided learning in graduate school. Wonderful team of research staff and support as well. So here's the story in the last 10 years for cardiovascular devices. And the story is one of consistent and impressive growth. These are Medicare beneficiaries receiving implantable cardiovascular devices, and this would include stents, defibrillators, VADs, anything that is classified as a device that remains in the patient post-procedure. And the rate of growth has really been phenomenal. Over a 10-year period in Medicare alone, a 52% increase in the annual number of procedures. And just put a little moniker for Medtronic there to represent that. But now over 1 million Medicare beneficiaries every year are receiving an implantable cardiovascular device. And there's been really a remarkable stream of innovation coming from the medical device companies, right? So these are sort of just the greatest hits. Out of about 320 Class 3 FDA approvals for medical devices, approximately 140 of them have been cardiovascular devices in the last 10 years. So FDA has been very busy approving new devices. And here's some of the family of things that were approved. CRT defibrillators, destination therapy LVADs. ICDs have been around for a long time, but only in 03 and 05 did CMS extend coverage to primary prevention in the wake of the MATE-2 and SCUD-HEF trials. Drug-eluting coronary stents, where would we be without them? And then carotid arterial stent systems, which I'll focus on. So, again, an enormous stream of innovation. One of the slides that I don't show, but that I think is illustrative, is the growth in worldwide sales for Medtronic Corporation, which has gone from $1.5 billion to $15 billion in 15 years. So really a testament to the tremendous amount of innovation that we've experienced. And this is the other thing that we've experienced, which is a tremendous growth in annual U.S. healthcare costs. And lo and behold, and perhaps not without irony, it's also about a 50% increase over a 10-year period of time. And these are inflation-adjusted dollars, so we can't just attribute this to inflation in the economy. We are now approaching, in 2010, the magic mark of $2.5 trillion each year spent on health care. When we talk to our graduate students or medical students for that matter, about how to conceive of $2.5 trillion, the example I like to use is you take the vibrant and incredibly productive economy of India and double it, and you get the $2.5 trillion mark. So it's a tremendous amount of resources being spent in the United States on health care, and one might think that devices have a role. So I'm not sure that this figure will be on the minds of the American voter today. It probably should be. This is the Congressional Budget Office's projection for federal spending over the next 70 years. And by the way, there's about 40 years of history towards the back. We are where the red arrow is in 2010. There was, of course, a bump in additional spending over the last couple of years. But the mega trend, right, is the middle blue, that the amount of federal spending, and this is also in the wake of health care reforms, or recall health care reform did not do too terribly much to change the ultimate trend, which is an enormous amount of additional funds will be spent on health care over the next 70 years, rapidly eclipsing the other components of federal expenditures and reaching a level of expense that really has never been seen before. So that's where we're headed, at least according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. And this is the budget buster, right? It's the amount that we spend on health care. So any talk about Social Security reform or cutbacks in any other spending are really quite irrelevant to the fiscal stability of the U.S. It really is, what are we going to do about health care? Okay, so that's my background, and then let's talk a little bit about healthcare costs. So these are the biggest ticket items for Medicare in terms of DRG expenses, sum total in 2006, and that's the latest data we can get from CMS so far. But these are the major things, at least the top 6, that Medicare spending hospital payments on. Tops are still orthopedics, so it makes us feel good if we're not in the orthopedic business, that at least we haven't displaced number 1. But heart failure is number 2, PCI is number 5, and ICDs of various flavors are number 6. So the kinds of things that we do in cardiovascular medicine really are up there as far as the major expenses in healthcare. So maybe we're headed to some kind of Armageddon, right, where that ultimately the buying prowess or the borrowing prowess, mind you, of the United States is going to reach a limit where we can no longer afford the kind of technological growth that we have come to assume is acceptable over the last, say, 40 years. And so now the question comes, what do we do about that, right? And one question that I spend a fair amount of my time asking is, why do costs grow, and what role does technology have to play? And, if you look way back in terms of health economic literature, to the primordial ooze out of which somebody like Joe Newhouse emerged, noted health economist at Harvard, his claim from the get-go was that it was medical technology, that it wasn't malpractice, that it wasn't the organization and delivery of health care, that it wasn't administrative costs, that it wasn't outrageous physician salaries, that it actually was technology, which was the consistent driver across nations and across health systems of healthcare costs. He's recently done an update to suggest, well, yes, there are other components we can potentially address, but the technology and particular innovation is still the leading culprit. So one question is how we measure and project costs of innovation. And I cut my teeth in this role that I'm in, doing cost-effectiveness analysis, and I still do them with my fellows, and I really appreciate the methodologic rigor in which they are done. But I think in many ways, classical cost-effectiveness analysis has given us an incomplete method of projecting the costs of new technology. And so let me demonstrate a little bit. Classical cost-effectiveness analysis, as done by me and others, takes account the upfront cost of a new treatment, we'll put that in green, and compares that to the substitute treatment in yellow, and then looks downstream at the downstream costs and effects right, integrates that all with some massive Markov process that used to take 3 days to run, but we have faster computers, so now it takes 3 hours, and we come up with an incremental cost-effectiveness ratio. And maybe that's done through a model, or maybe that's done through a clinical trial, but nevertheless, that is the fundamental way in which we've all been taught to think about the incremental economic benefit of innovation. And there's nothing wrong with that approach, right? I mean, that has been well grounded in economic theory. It, kind of ascribes its beginnings to Pareto and ideas about optimization of expenses. And so it's perfectly good, but I think it ignores two important assumptions. And one important assumption is that the introduction of a new technology, replacing an older technology, never results in more or fewer or different patients being treated. Right? Because we usually do these things in the context of clinical trials, where, if you have the economic arm of the trial, and it's collecting costs and outcomes of both arms of the trial, and patients drop out of the trial, but there's not a fundamental change in the population of patients being treated, right? I mean, that's sort of discerned at the very beginning in terms of your enrollment criteria. And so why might that assumption be wrong? Well, economic theory would say that if a new technology comes along that is better, or even is perceived as better as a substitute technology, and we'll take drug-eluting stents compared to bare metal stents in 2003, by definition, demand for the new technology should exceed that of the demand for the old technology. Right? It's likely to increase the number of patients who are going to be treated with PCI if we believe at all that drug-eluting stents are better than BMS. Okay? And what kind of patients are going to be drawn in for treatment? In general, it are going to be patients who are marginal cases, right? For whom, and again, there's plenty of room for irrational behavior in medicine. I practice a lot of my own irrational behavior in medicine. But on the whole, if we think about what kind of new patients are getting PCI in the year 2005 who are not getting PCI in 2002, it would presumably be those patients on the margin, meaning who are now deemed to be appropriate PCI candidates, but who weren't deemed to be PCI candidates in 2002. And those usually are on two opposite ends of the spectrum. There are patients who are too sick to undergo therapy, but now the benefits outweigh the risks, and so let's go ahead and treat. And there are also patients who are too well to be treated, where the benefits didn't override the benefits of doing nothing, but now since the benefits are greater, we'll go ahead and treat. And so there's a fundamental difference, right, in the dynamics of the treated population. And this is not captured, I mean, at least in my versions of cost-effectiveness models, or the ones I read in the literature, the assumption is pretty much the technology comes in, but everything else is ceteris paribus. I mean, it's exactly the same as before, and that's not likely to be the case. Okay, so moving ahead, the other assumption that is essential to classical medical technology assessment is that the technology only influences the costs and outcomes of the treated patients. Right? So again, borrowing from the context of the clinical trial, the drug-eluting stent is given to a random half, the bare metal stent is given to a random other half. This is, the Sirius trial or Taxus or what have you. Costs and outcomes are measured in both arms, but that the rest of the world essentially remains the same. Right? And we all know that that is fundamentally not true, that the introduction of new technology not only influences what goes on for treated patients with PCI. For example, so let's say there's a fixed number of patients. In the old regime, they went from nuclear imaging to the cath lab, and then they eventually got their Taxus stent. But there are other patients, right, who go to nuclear imaging in the cath lab, and they don't need PCI, so we stop there. And there you had a third group of patients, right, who go for nuclear imaging, and they're not really found to be appropriate for a catheterization, so they get an echo as a consolation prize, right? I mean, that's the technological pathway. And so you could say, well, new technology comes on and drives up demand, right? So there are more patients now taking that top road where they go all the way to treatment. But there inevitably are going to be more patients in the other pathways associated with the process of diagnosing and treating coronary disease who are going to not go all the way to treatment, but are more likely to get imaging, are more likely to get diagnostic testing, might be more likely to get echoes because who knows, they have to see a cardiologist, something must be done. That's going to change the cost structure, right, in a way that, again, classical cost-effectiveness analysis does not typically capture. All right, so now to move on, I put this up because we should all recite this every morning. This is, I mean, I'm now living in the comparative effectiveness era, and I have to remember what it exactly is, and it still amuses me that Congress funded it with billions of dollars, and then they defined it, which is an interesting kind of 1-2 for the federal government, and not necessarily surprising. But HHS commissioned a coordinating council to come up with this definition after the ERA Act was passed. You know, and this is the kind of stuff that we've been doing for a long time, so it's very encouraging. But what is its implications to these questions about cost? Right? Because if we're then going to talk about what are the economic impacts of treatment, we are not just talking about treatment versus control, but what is the world like in a clinical world where there is a new interventional technology or even a new diagnostic technology, a new drug treatment, et cetera, and how does that change the entire milieu in terms of the cost that will be borne by payers? Okay, so that's the context. Bring it down to what kind of research I've been doing. So most recently I've been very enamored of this idea of looking at geographic differences in the utilization of major medical technologies and seeing what we can glean from this well-trod path by the Dartmouth Atlas. And for those of you who don't read the Dartmouth Atlas every night, I encourage it. It's a great read, puts you right to sleep very quickly. But as we know, there's a tremendous amount of variation in the use of cardiovascular interventions across the country. These are the hospital referral regions. There are 306 of them. They were designed by Elliot Fisher. And this is the likelihood that a Medicare patient with an acute coronary syndrome gets PCI, right? So the range is between, the white is 0 to 15%, the dark blue is 45 to 62%. There seems to be a very dense area in the Rocky Mountains where everybody gets PCI, and in the rest of the country there's a variety of things going on. But this phenomenon poses some opportunity for research because now we can say if there are geographic differences which tend to persist, what can we learn about costs and outcomes just based on this, which doesn't, there's not a random distribution here, but at the same time enough diversity that we may be able to learn some things. Okay, that's the approach. Here's my aim for this project I'll share today. Can we look at the healthcare expenditures in these little regions, these hospital referral areas, as they changed during the time of drug-eluting stent introduction? So FDA approved in April of 2003. So starting at 2002, going through 2006, and counting the cost not just in patients who receive PCI, but in the broader population of patients with coronary disease, what happened to the costs to Medicare in areas which were high users of drug-eluting stents and low users of drug-eluting stents? And was there a correlated relationship? Okay? That's the basic strategy. All right, cost changes across these HRRs over a 5-year period for Medicare beneficiaries defined by their diagnosis, not whether they received treatment or not, and to see if the geographic variation in DES use is associated with geographic variation in cost. All right. Data sources, I use a lot of Medicare data. It's a lot of fun, interesting things all the time in terms of how the government reimburses for care. And this particular study depended on the 5% random sample of fee-for-service beneficiaries. It's just a random draw. There are about 39 million Medicare beneficiaries. This is randomly drawing 1.8 million, focusing only on the over 65, focusing only on the fee-for-service bennies. And looking specifically at the patients aged 66 to 85. After 85, believe it or not, patients are somewhat less likely to get PCI, although you know and I know plenty of friends who've had it at those advanced ages. It's less common. So we're focusing where the energy is, and we started at age 66, so we have at least 1 year of antecedent claims. We're going to use the HRR because I like Elliot Fisher and I like his definitions, and they're widely accepted now that they got so much press. And once Peter Orszag mentions it, and the former budget director for the Obama White House, it must be the designated area for health services research. So that's what we're going to use. There are 306 of them. We assign patients to HRR based on their zip code. So here's what we did. We have identified patients, whether they have coronary disease, and we divide them into 3 subgroups because it turns out that there are kind of 3 things that can happen to patients with coronary disease that dramatically impact the pathway for costs. So you can have an AMI, and so everybody who had an AMI in the same year or last 3 months of the previous calendar year was in the AMI group. There are patients who had an acute coronary syndrome without infarction, again, same year or last 3 months of the prior calendar year. And there are patients then with coronary disease, but with no acute coronary syndrome. So, coronary disease on an outpatient claim, coronary disease on last year's claims, AMI in the past, but no recent events. Okay, so 3 flavors of coronary disease patients. And this is, the way in which we divide up diagnosis is not too dissimilar from the way Medicare uses its chronic conditions warehouse to assign cohorts of coronary disease patients. Relatively stable numbers of patients per year, I'll show you in a moment. And so, the question is, what was the average cost among these 3 cohorts over time in each HRR? So the critical variable is the payer perspective costs, and we can talk a lot about whether it should be payer perspective, meaning how much money is coming out of Medicare's pocket, insurers, and patients, or whether it should be the actual cost of the procedure, which is difficult to glean, though can be done with some heroics from claims data. But we're going to focus from the payer perspective, since what I'm saying is this is the burden that society has to pay. And that can be extracted from claims by the amount Medicare pays, by what Medicare calls the primary insurer. I was recently informed that Medicare is universally considered the secondary insurer for everybody it covers. The primary insurer might be absent, but it's never the primary insurer. And then coinsurance and deductibles that the patients pay. All patients' costs with coronary disease, including claims, for podiatric issues. Every Medicare claim is rolled up by patient into the 1-year cost window, and all those patients with coronary disease in each of the 3 sub-cohorts are averaged within the HRR. Okay, so a bunch of averages, a bunch of combinations, but essentially what we're calculating are 3 average costs. The average cost of patients with AMI in a particular area, the average cost of patients with acute coronary syndromes without infarct in a particular area, and the average cost of patients with coronary disease without ACS. Okay, 3 average costs. And those are followed across time, right? So we have 2002 through 2006. People asked about, so what about downstream costs, right? Because, drug-eluting stents are supposed to save money down the road with fewer target vessel revascularizations. That's going to be captured by the design, right? Because nobody's going to leave the cohort, right? You have a drug-eluting stent in 2004. You're still going to be in the cohort in 2005. If you're saving money to Medicare, it's going to happen in 2005 or 2006, right? Or it's not going to happen. There's some, you can make some arguments toward the end that might not be the case, but most of the trends we're seeing are not in the last 6 months of 2006, okay? So seems to me to be a reasonable way of capturing downstream costs because patients don't leave the cohort once you get coronary disease. It's sort of never fixed, at least from a claims perspective. Okay, so here are my independent variables in the model. So percentage of DES use in that subgroup in each year, and each HRR, right? Most of you know enough about claims to know that it's fairly easy to identify drug-eluting stents. Drug-eluting stents drive institutional reimbursement, so there's very little incentive for institutions such as mine or yours to put down a code other than the appropriate one for drug-eluting stents. Some covariates. include the average, what's called a DXCG risk score. So this is a very well-validated, Arlene Ash at Boston University devised method of controlling for costs related to comorbidities and demographics. So you can sort of put in a patient's demographics and comorbidities and get a reasonable projection of what their anticipated Medicare costs will be in the next year. So that was put in. Again, it's not related to cardiovascular procedures, which makes it a helpful covariate. A couple other things we added in addition to the risk score was some measure of local Medicare inflation. Because one of the things we were concerned about in the model was would we be picking up local differences in healthcare inflation if we didn't have something to control for the fact that sometimes healthcare costs rise more quickly in some areas than others. There were really two ways to do it. The less appealing but off-the-shelf method was just to take the Dartmouth Atlas average Medicare cost per penny per year. We decided to spend a lot more time without actually getting any benefit of 3 weeks of developing our own cost index independent of cardiovascular disease. So sort of taking all the patients who didn't have coronary disease, and there may be 20 of them in Medicare, but nevertheless, taking those patients, rolling up their costs, averaging them, matching them across years, so there's no difference, and then calculating an index. It turns out that makes actually zero difference. I was very excited that we get some reviews that would get out. It didn't mention it at all. It's that's a nice index. So it just shows you can spend a lot of time trying to fix problems that don't actually occur. Nevertheless, the idea is to control for inflation, right? I mean, it's like the anticipated reviewer response, and it's never what you actually get. I was like, you're never criticized for the things you should be criticized for. Here's our model. Eric told me I shouldn't have equations, but here's an equation for you, right? So there's economists in the room, or economist wannabes and social scientists. So here it is. It's average cost at the HRR and time level as a function of the percent DES use, which is technology, the change in risk score, and the change in that local cost index. There's some controls for years and controls for what are called HRR fixed effects, meaning there's a dummy variable in the regression for every single HRR. Right? So if you think, they're just measuring places which just do a robust amount of stuff and have done so since the beginning of time, no, because that's going to be captured in the HRR fixed effect. Right? So whatever is happening is a marginal effect happening year to year. Okay? That's the model. Here's the sample size. You guys are doing a wonderful job of getting rid of AMI and acute coronary syndrome because the numbers, at least in Medicare, have been going down, although the numbers of non-acute coronary syndrome patients are rising at a higher rate. So the total number of coronary patients seems higher. Some of this phenomenon is the loss of patients to HMO coverage. We deal with averages, so I'm a little bit less concerned about that. I'm not sure all the HMO patients are having the disproportionate number of AMIs, ACS. That's perhaps another paper, but nevertheless, these are the phenomenon we see over those 6 years. Here's what happened in drug-eluting stents. In our 3 cohorts, it turns out acute coronary syndromes are most popular. 30% of ACS patients undergo DES by the end of 2006. We'll claim everybody started at 0 in 2002 prior to FDA approval. I know their clinical trials, et cetera. Let's just call it 0. AMI patients, about 24%, actually 23% in 2006. In the non-ACS cohort, right, 1.5% of non-ACS patients per year. Right, so 1 in 60 or something like that. All right, not a huge number. Okay, here are the real cost increases. So kind of you can relate that to those bars, like what component of those bars going up to 2.5 trillion was in ischemic heart disease. Well, it turned out AMI, and these are 5-year percent change above inflation, right? So if it was just at the rate of inflation, that rate should be 0%. So AMI performed reasonably well, something like corporate bonds, about a 4.3% increase in costs over that 5-year period. Acute coronary syndrome, a little bit better, 7%. Non-acute coronary syndrome was where the money is, a 14% increase in average cost for Medicare beneficiary over 5 years. That is sort of what Medicare says. The historical increase in Medicare spending has been about 2 to 3 percentage points per year, and that does get you to about 14%. So again, what do you think is driving the cost? This is at least across the ischemic heart disease cohorts in Medicare where the cost increases are falling. And here's our results. So let me walk you through. These are so if you focus just on, there are three subgroups, as I keep mentioning, and just to focus on the first column, which are the change in average costs for all patients, not just device recipients, for all patients in the subgroup based on a 1 percentage point increase in drug-eluting stent use. So going, again, I said, remember, 0 to 22%. For each percentage point increase in acute coronary syndrome patients, the increase for all patients was about $35. Right? This is including a whole number of patients who weren't treated, right? But I'm not going to worry about ascribing cost increases to patients who actually received treatment, right? Because we're concerned that there's going to be cost increases in other patients as well. $28 per patient with AMI per percentage increase in an area in drug-eluting stent. And then $133 per 1 percentage point increase in drug-eluting stent use for non-ACS patients. Okay, so since this is, and the other stuff really I will say is risk score about predicted the same thing which, in each patient, which was very close to the design of the model, so I felt good about that. Something odd going on with our cost index for AMI patients. It actually doesn't influence the conclusion very much at all. It simply means that AMI was somehow more affected by inflation in a local level than others. So, and again, I'm not sure at all if that is significant or not. So let me translate into population terms. So, because that's interesting, but what does it mean to a Medicare policymaker? And so if you roll up those incremental per patient costs by the percentage increase in each group, by the amount of increase that we saw over a 5-year period, by the number of patients in that cohort, right? So we're talking about a per patient increase over a period of time where the percentage point increase was variable in each group. These are the numbers you get. So drug-eluting stents were actually relatively evenly used across these three subgroups, which is, I thought, a remarkable finding in and of itself. So about 241,000 drug-eluting stents in 2006, only felt like 241 million. The attributable cost, which comes right from our regression model, is total cost for drug-eluting stents, $1.6 billion, of which in the AMI subgroup, 236 million were attributed to AMI patients, 239 to non-AMI acute coronary syndrome patients, and 1.1 billion of additional costs attributed to drug-eluting stent use in non-ACS patients. If you carve those percentages up, 70% of the attributable drug-eluting costs to non-ACS patients. So those of you who read the COURAGE trial and try to practice evidence-based medicine, there's kind of an initial take on this, that this would not necessarily, you would think, be the place we'd want to spend as a society lots more money on PCI, since the likelihood of PCI of any variety improving the outcomes of non-ACS patients is questionable. And believe me, I treat angina, we treat angina. It's important and it's appropriate to use PCI in those patients. But to say that most of the economic burden is been borne by patients who have non-ACS seems not how we would want to design a new innovation. Okay? 69%. There are a couple other ways you could have projected costs. Okay, so this is my column here based on the regression. Another way you could do it, if you're sitting around in Medicare and trying to figure out how much these things are going to cost us over time, is to just multiply the difference in DRG reimbursement. Right? Because you might think, okay, I'm not going to worry about downstream costs. We can't really predict those very well, but at least I know that we're going to pay hospitals more. So let's just take the volume of DRGs for bare metal stents and up that by the incremental difference in DRG reimbursement. Right? Sounds fair enough? So you do all that and you get a grand total of $500 million. Right? So about a third of what I'm projecting. Right? Sounds completely reasonable from a kind of back-of-the-envelope policy perspective. let's take another step and just say, well, let's do a cost-effectiveness analysis based on the clinical trial. Let's pick the Sirius trial, which was actually the linchpin in getting drug-eluting stents approved by the FDA. And it was an excellently done, and this again has nothing to say about the authors of those studies, who I consider good colleagues and did a wonderful job. Their projection would say that drug-eluting stents would cost Medicare $75 million, right? I mean, there's a simple math to that. Their projection was a use of a drug-eluting stent as opposed to a bare metal stent in a procedure, and you can argue with me about how many stents per procedure, but with switching procedures from primarily bare metal stents to drug-eluting stents, the projection for the cost-effectiveness analysis was about $300 per patient, with downstream savings built in. Right? $300 per patient. There's about, as we said, about 400,000, 500,000 procedures. You get to 75. The math is very clear, right? So it's like, I'm sorry, not 500, 250,000 procedures, $300, 75 million, right? I mean, that was the fundamental problem, right, is we are projecting a very different economic effect of a new technology than what appears to be the case. And I'm not saying my numbers are airtight, but this seems to be magnitudes different than what we're actually experiencing, okay? So this is one of my there's so many good cartoons in the last year, my friends, about health policy. It's never going to be this good. But this is my... so this is which unnecessary procedures would you be referring to? I mean, this is the question, right? It's like, what has happened since one might argue the drug-eluting stents have provided a real but incremental benefit in the armamentarium to provide to patients? What has happened to suddenly lead to this massive influx of new costs? All right? And is there anything we can do about that? So I have another project which I wanted to share, but I think I actually, because there hasn't been enough interruptions in the room, might want to let you all talk and get your thoughts on that. I'll share it quickly just because I don't want to leave you with a question and not suggest one answer. So let me share it quickly. This is the thing we do for our fellows, which is kind of, what's the problem with medical innovation today? And the problem with medical innovation is we have sort of designed a system which assumes that all innovation is good, right? And so I took this kind of plane down here yesterday. It's called a subsonic jet. It was designed, before I was born. It hasn't really improved, really. In fact, it's gotten worse, probably from a traveler's perspective. But it's the same technology that was flying around in 1959. There's this great new technology. Have you heard about it? It's called supersonic jet travel. You go there faster. They pressurize the cabin at sea level so your ears don't pop. Wonderful way to travel. It's completely economic, infeasible, right? Never got off the ground, needed huge amounts of government subsidies. Plane crashes in Paris 10 years ago, they take it off the market. And you can see how many other companies have rushed in to sell supersonic jet transports to airlines. Like none, right? I mean, and we would presume, okay, this thing was developed in the 1960s, right? I mean, clearly we're richer. I mean, how come we can't afford supersonic jet travel? It's because we can't afford it. Right? The market has spoken, and no one but a few in the room can afford supersonic jet travel, so the market doesn't bear it. Okay? Here's what we actually get from the innovators at Boeing, right? Is this enormous airplane on the right. It's the Airbus 380. It has like 900 seats. It has 9 rows. It can fly from here to Taiwan and back on a tank of gas. It's incredibly efficient at moving people, right? This is what the air travel innovation industry developed simply because the market is now demanding fewer dollars per seat traveled some amount of miles, right? This is not how we do medical technology, but it works in other industries. We could go on and on about why markets don't work in medicine. Markets don't work in medicine. One critical issue, and this actually came up at the QCOR meetings, which I highly recommend everybody should go to, the American Heart Association's Quality of Care and Outcomes Research Forum. Great exchange between Mark Latke, a cardiologist at Stanford, one of my mentors, and one of the economists who had brought in and was saying, this is how we're going to improve health care, or bend the cost curve. Has that phrase gotten tired? I think it has. But how we're going to bend the cost curve is we are going to institute payment reform. right? We're going to pay people, physicians, hospitals differently. And Mark raised his hand. He said, but wait a second. Didn't Joe Newhouse said that independently of how we pay physicians and hospitals and how we design our healthcare systems and what language we're using and what our cultural norms are, it's technology that drives up costs of care? And so if you're talking about accountable care organizations or medical homes or a variety of bundled payments or all the things that are talked about in terms of payment reform, what are we going to do about technology? Isn't it at some point a fundamental issue that we need to do technology better? It's not just about how physicians and hospitals are paid. So it was an interesting exchange of, well, that's right, but our payment reforms will be different. So I don't know. I really think it is the fundamental question here, because if payment reforms don't work, then we are in big trouble. That's the promise of Medicare's recent ACA, was the payment reforms are going to be designed that bend the cost curve. All right, quick, because I do want to discuss carotid stents, which I hope there are some who are interested in cardiovascular outside of the chest. But when you get outside of the chest a little bit to the north, there's the carotid artery. There's a new technology out, FDA approved in 2005, called the carotid stent with cerebral protection, which is a nice umbrella which prevents the unfortunate side effect of stroke, which bedeviled initial use of stents in the neck. Sapphire came out and showed carotid stents were comparable to endarterectomy. FDA quickly approved, CMS covered in 2005, and they had this great, really clever coverage policy, which essentially said, unlike any other Medicare coverage policy, we're going to demand that hospitals prove you can do this, at least with a bunch of criteria that have no basis in evidence whatsoever, but that when we sit around the room, we think these would actually be markers of quality. And I do say that because there isn't much good evidence about which markers of hospital quality predict good outcomes for carotid stents. Nevertheless, Medicare is who it is, and it can set the hoops. So here are the hoops to jump through. And what happened then? Right? I mean, here's Medicare's coverage policy with a specific goal being to prohibit hospitals from using this technology that would not do it well. And my question would just be, did this prohibit some hospitals from using technology? I'm going to skip ahead to some results because, we had some thoughts on whether that would also increase equity and a beautiful regression model, which I could go on and on about, but I won't. Here's what happened to the number of hospitals in Medicare certifying to provide carotid arterial stent services. If you're wondering when your hospital, because I looked, certified, it was on the very first day of eligibility for CMS, as did my hospital, as did most other academic centers, right? Not to be left behind by the pathway of innovation. Nevertheless, the number of hospitals across the nation capped at slightly less than 900 offering carotid arterial stent services. What about other cardiovascular services? Well, it turns out there are about 1,500 hospitals nationwide that have the facilities to provide vascular stenting, whether they do PCI, they do renal stenting, they have interventional radiology. We're talking about 1,500 facilities. And it turns out the carotid stents, which are down on the right, and if you look at the blue bars first, almost everybody does endarterectomy. I mean, if you have a gas station out back in a hospital bed, you're doing endarterectomy. Drug-eluting stents, slightly less popular. A lot of hospitals do ICDs. CABG in 75% of America's hospitals with some amount of cardiovascular procedures, but only 60% of hospitals at the end of all this adoption did carotid arterial stents. And the numbers were even lower if you get rid of the regions that had a major hospital that was doing stents as part of a clinical trial. Right? So this is, if you throw out those hospitals and just look at the hospitals that hadn't been using the stents prior to FDA approval, which means they didn't have a group of investigators doing research, it turned out that only half of those hospitals were using carotid stents at the end of this adoption period, compared to almost, again, everybody is doing carotid endarterectomy. Right? So this is maybe the promise. Right? I mean, it's very clear, and if it is not clear to you now, it might be clear at 10 o'clock this evening, that the era of publicly defined, centrally administered rationing of health care is nothing that we're going to see in the near future. Right? So the way that healthcare is going to have to be rationed is implicitly, and one of the ways we can implicitly rationing is by reducing the number of sites that are able to provide care. Again, one might argue there's a quality argument to be made. I mean, what are those those hospitals that didn't use carotid stents? And who would have been treated, right? If there had been no such policy, and I can't argue to you how many more hospitals would have adopted. I don't know. I keep trying to guess the counterfactual. This implies there would have been some counterfactual higher number of hospitals. But what was the quality that was going to come out of those hospitals? And perhaps also maybe this starts to improve those cost functions, right? That if we in fact limit the number of providers, we get higher quality, we get less of this cost amplifying effect that occurs when we do blanket coverage. All right? I won't talk about the regression, but I will talk about some conclusions. And basically, I have 2 points to say. I think there's a really interesting, inevitable conflict here, right? Between our country's ability to borrow money to pay for health care, which I think is actually finite, and the pathway of innovation, which has been explosive. Those are 2 fundamentally irreconcilable trends. And whether that day of reckoning occurs in 5 years or in 12 years or in 20 years, there is some day of reckoning where the government simply cannot pay for that and also provide for the national defense and various other things that we do. So some cost control is coming, and what flavor it takes is interesting. Technologies do amplify costs. I think that was one of our key findings of our first study. But there is a promise, right, that if we can't do explicit rationing as a society, there are ways in which coverage can be designed, and whether it be centers of excellence or demanding quality, where we can actually make the cost-benefit ratio go more in our favor. So I'm sorry I didn't leave enough time for questions that I wanted, but now you guys please talk and give me your thoughts. Way in the back.
Typically, when you consider that a technology increases in cost, there's innovation. Over a period of time, the cost of the technology comes down, at least in industries like aircraft industry or whatever. How does that work in medicine? That's my first question.
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon. We've been looking at trends in drug-eluting stent costs in Medicare, and they are slightly coming down. There's but probably only by 5 to 10%. What is harder to argue, right, is that the presence of new technologies make doctors behave more efficiently. Like they're even more judicious about who they send for diagnostic imaging, about who they refer, about who they do additional testing on. So, I think the fundamental thing here really isn't the cost difference between drug-eluting stent and bare metal stent that is driving costs up. It is the behavior of clinicians and health systems, which in the advent of more things to do for patients really changes behavior. Another study we're doing is watching what happened to CABG. There was a huge drop in CABG over the last 8 years, which what are cardiac surgeons doing with their time? I really wonder this. There's perhaps 1 or 2 in the room. You have more time, you're doing other things. But the benefit of kind of innovation making it done more efficiently seems to be completely overwhelmed with this idea of there's more technology in the market, we have so much more we can do. Let's at least rule out the possibility that this patient is a drug-eluting stent candidate.
And do we consider, when we're doing these models, do we consider the fact that maybe the patient is healthier, so from a society perspective, improved economic activity that comes from healthier patients and so on, just to broaden the perspective?
Yeah, that's all my friends in medical device industry say, that all the economic models fail to account for the incredibly increased productivity. So if you tell me the drug-eluting stents are making people more productive, I guess I can't argue with that from some perspective. I'm again, not sure that drug-eluting stents make people more productive than the bare metal stents did. More seriously, if it's replacing CABG, one could argue among working-age individuals, I think that potentially is an argument to be made. It's hard to imagine that economic benefit, especially in the Medicare population, where only 1 in 18 Americans are working, overwhelms the Medicare costs. It certainly doesn't provide the additional tax revenue. Or it won't after the end of the evening. So,
yeah, thanks for that. I guess I take a little bit of. I want to challenge you on this idea that the costs are high, and so we have to limit the variable costs related to administration of any technology.
The truth of the matter is costs are high because the fixed costs are high. So, it doesn't make a difference if I do 1 stent here or 5 stents here. We're still paying for, really beautiful buildings. Mm-hmm. And we have, you go to Europe and you see cathedrals, and you come to the United States and you see hospitals. It's a very warped view of the world.
I get the same feeling inside, Kevin, when I go into both, but that's okay. Yeah.
So, it's die. In the United States, it's die. Gives you that warmth. So I don't know. I think we've scared the public by saying the only choice is technology or not technology. Mm-hmm. So look, frankly, if I did colonoscopy in my office, it'd save $1,000. Yep. The French do more bone marrow transplants than the Americans do, and so the real enemy here is our cost structure. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, maybe if I got down to 12% of GDP, I'd have to think about how much I want to limit technology. Yep. But between here and there, our business practices, overhead, inefficient administration, and decisions that we make to build the world's most expensive infrastructure. Yep. And in fact, so it's not rationing. And even if I did ration one little thing, I still have that overhead cost, and I haven't done anything about that.
Yeah, I don't dispute that at all, Kevin. I think that there is I don't know if this is either-or argument. I think of the things that we have built at our own institution, and not to pick on ours any more than yours, but, that kind of cater to the needs of patients who are receiving high-end technology therapy. So, we put in a $5 million proton beam treatment. Now, there are going to be patients who need that therapy, and maybe a Morris shop is the right place to deliver that care. I guess I would say, is rationing scaring the public? Of course it is. In some sense, you can't use the word anymore without creating a kind of emotional backlash that just kind of wipes away any rational conversation. Whether it is the great stuff that we do and that can bill for that drives the cathedrals up, or whether the cathedrals in some way and the organizational behavior drives excessive revenues that, I don't know. And again, I'm not sure that one drives the other. I think it's been a nice partnership of convenience that we do wonderful technology innovation. We put in a tremendous number of VADs at Penn. The VADs pay a lot of money. That money goes into building a new center. We attract more patients because of that. That is our business model. It works wonderfully well. Our health system is in the black. I don't know. I don't know where that change. I don't think the change can be made just at one level. I agree with you.
That was a really tremendous talk. I do a fair amount of work at the VA, just like you do, and I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about the differences in the way the VA handles costs. Obviously, there's a tremendous amount of rationing that occurs in the VA. Just in each visit, for example, there isn't a cath lab in every VA hospital. But have you done any work within the VA system to see how there's a reasonable way to contain costs? For example, we tend to negotiate drug prices, whereas Medicare Part D can't. That seems to me a fundamental part of what we do.
It's interesting. In VA, we do the classic method that works for rationing care, which is implicit rationing in VA, right? If you wait long enough, you'll get your procedure, or if you're willing to travel, or you're willing to see the subspecialist, or you'll get your echo in 6 weeks, you'll get your DES in 2 months. This somehow actually works, and there's been some studies looking at this idea that this is somehow acceptable to society, that to be told that you wait in line, you'll get it, even if the line is 9 months long, is in general much more acceptable than saying we are going to select the best candidates. There are 20 of them. You don't make it. The cut is here. So the VA, in some sense, does classic implicit medical care rationing. I can't imagine it's making the right decisions. Like who eventually makes it to, say, cardiac surgery in VA is much more of a function of the patient's social support, their likelihood for showing up, their trust in their physician, or, rather than some clinical indicator for whether they'd be an appropriate candidate for AVR. I mean, and so I think there's a problem, right? I mean, it's acceptable. We can pull it off. The British can pull it off. The Canadian, with some arguments on the fringe, the Canadians can sort of pull it off. I'm not sure that necessarily gets the right people in the door. It gets the persistent ones in the door, the well-heeled, the ones who have resources. I'm not sure that's optimal. It does contain costs. Dr. Mark.
Great talk. I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. We turn yours off. I'm glad I got that.
I should be used to that by now. So at the beginning of the talk, you mentioned the whole $1 billion of comparative effectiveness research. And those of us like yourself who are in the business wonder how that investment is going to at all translate into the ostensible objective of bending the cost curve. And one is concerned that perhaps it won't at all have an effect, at least not the intended effect, but that it'll fund a lot of sort of mediocre research that will do little to clarify the practice of medicine as it needs to be clarified. What's your opinion about putting more teeth perhaps into the CMS and the payers and forcing the collection of evidence for reimbursement or participation in clinical trials to bring in new technologies, and looking at the history of the evolution of technology as we've seen it, particularly in cardiology, when you think about like reperfusion therapy and some of the other things, and the somewhat tortuous path to get from the initial foray to a mature technology. Is there a danger that trying to work this out with the brakes of cost control firmly applied and the dissemination control would actually throttle the ability to get to the final mature technology in a way that might be not so much in our interest?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up so many issues. So comparative effectiveness, maybe we could dispense with how efficiently we all spent that $1 billion in the stimulus funds. I'm sure there was the frenzy of grant writing here that we had at Penn, and like a lot of projects put together without a lot of thought, and money pushed out the door. And so I'm going to assume that money is just gone. There is the money that is allocated for the PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which is part of the Accountable Care Act, that will have independent funding, we think, to support comparative effectiveness. I'm certainly, as you know, all in favor for payers and other stakeholders to demand better outcomes data and to start collecting meaningful, searchable data structures so that we can determine, for example, which companies for which devices have which safety record. I mean, we don't even have a good method for determining, who's, other than the mod, like send in if something bad happens, the way for like just monitoring the devices that are in Medicare beneficiaries. I am concerned that the politics are perhaps not on our side, that there is the idea that, a lot of language in the Medicare bill, right, or the ACA was, you can make recommendations for, the PCORI can make, do research, but you can't use that to set thresholds. You can't use that to ration care. At some level, I think Medicare may punt this to the local health systems, whether that be, bundled payments, whether that be accountable care organizations, and say, you guys figure it out. You figure out how you're going to use technology. We're only paying you $3,200 per heart failure patient. You've got 150 of those in your accountable care organization. That's the money you have. You want to spend that on ICDs. You want to spend that on LVADs. Go right ahead. But we're going to be watching your outcomes, and we're going to publish that. I'm not sure that's where we're headed, because I'm not sure it's going to happen at the federal level anytime soon. Nice game.